Today is October 15th. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Nagana go, Meko che, Stokom Aki. Hi, my name is Red Thunder Woman. My English name is Michelle Robinson. I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands were signed on September 22nd, 1877 as Treaty 7, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley Chiniki Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney Nation, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been so kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mokinstus as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. My father is so Canadian, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having an Indian Act imposed status card. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe, meaning many horse town, named after the cavalry stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, honoring the host as a guest, and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share what I know as I walk down my red road. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for showing your support. I wish you all knew how much you're helping me during this move right now, so thank you. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. If you cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. You can also give a review, which helps whichever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe, and you can go to Native Calgarian for the latest podcast and the pin posts on social media. So today I have a special guest with me. Catherine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Catherine Whelan Costen, and I live south of Calgary, Alberta, and close to the Siksika Nation. And I'm just honored to be here to have a discussion, a chat. I used to have my own online chat show, and I'm not sure if I'm completely finished with that, but it's called Let's Get Real, Chatting with Catherine. And it came from that passion to speak, to explore, to go deeper than sound bites. I ran in a couple of elections, federally and provincially, and really got to know the inside of politics. I recommend it to everyone, just to get to know our system, what we're dealing with, what we're up against, kind of thing. I am in the process of writing a memoir on my experiences with trauma. I've had multiple events of trauma in my life, and I in my healing process, I opened up to my spiritual gifts and my spiritual insights. And a big part of my healing was understanding and letting go of some of the indoctrination that we all are living with from a very oppressive patriarchy. And so it was part of that exploration that led me, I had to write, I think I've on my 12th edit of my book at this point. And it's because the first several were part of the healing, to get it out, to hear my own voice. So important to share those stories. And we are living in a society with multiple generations of trauma in the settler world, as well as in the Indigenous world, from what I can hear when I hear the stories of the Indigenous peoples in Canada and across the world, in Australia and the United States, where we've been colonized. And so I'm very aware of the situations. There's so much I do not know, and I'm always open to learning and listening and hearing other people's stories. But part of it comes from finding out what my own story is, my own history. How did I get to where I am? How did I come to accept beliefs that were not my own, that were taught to me, regurgitated through the school system? We weren't taught to think in school. We were taught what to think, and that's where you got your best grades, was if you could regurgitate what the teacher knew and what the textbooks told you, not the actual thinking process. And I think that's a big part of where my passion is to not tell people I'm right, or even that I'm channeling wisdom from the universe, because that's one of the gifts that became clearer to me. I know I was born with that gift of clarity, but I didn't. And that's why I call myself Clarity Whisperer. And that's my website is Clarity Whisper Art and Soul, because as I grew in my healing, I began to explore different gifts. And one of them that came to me only recently, actually, it was March of this year, was my art. And I had my first online art show last night. So I was very excited to be able to share that. But so my journey is, and my passion is on sharing discussion, sharing the need for us to communicate with each other. And when whisperer came to me, not because of the cliche that there's horse whispers and there's this whispers, but it was the realization that perhaps because of all the trauma that I've been through, I have a really quick trigger. When someone yells at me, I shut down. I can't hear them. And we're doing, and I really feel like a lot of people have that trigger. If somebody yells, it instills that fear, and we only have, fight, flight, freeze. We are programmed that way. And if we don't settle that down and learn to have nonviolent communication, where we're actually interested in what the other person's point of view, and maybe trying to see it from their side, even if we don't agree, let them be heard. But we won't hear when people are yelling at us. And I noticed that, even as a child, when somebody's whispering, we go, I want to hear that. What are they whispering about? What is that? We say we've got a secret, or we all kinds of things that whisperer really comes with. So that, I think, hopefully that gives you the general of my, and we can talk about what my insights from the trauma. Open to that. I've had some powerful insights about how trauma and our programming around it, and our beliefs about death. And I hope I don't want to trigger anyone around that issue, because I know it is it's an issue. It's probably the biggest fear most of us have.
Honestly, Catherine, I think that's why I wanted you on the show, was because I think that's, I run Mending Broken Hearts. I unfortunately know so many people in my community that have regular deaths. And, we, first of all, are silenced, gaslit, and then, of course, we can't heal. But that bigger picture of that, we are never going to heal if we don't start talking about it. And so I give lots of resources at the end of my show for that reason. And of course, I invite you to give more. But ultimately, like, this is what I mean, my entire life is a trigger warning. And anyone who listens to this podcast knows, like, we're regularly reporting new murders by the police of our people, or whatever else that has happened, whatever media bull crap has been put on our people, politicians, et cetera, et cetera. Like, these are violence, acts of violence regularly. So, if we don't talk about it, we can't address them. So I just don't want you to feel like you have to pull a punch. In the opposite, I'd like you to talk about what has helped you heal, because in our spirituality, those whispers that you hear are usually our ancestors talking to us. And anything that you have seen helped you heal is what we want to share, because ultimately the Canadian government, Alberta government, the health system is not designed for us to heal. It's designed to hurt us and harm us. So if we are going to, disengage from that because of like in my case, the extreme racism in the healthcare system, and then the funding only going to the actual organizations that perpetrated the harm to begin with, whether it's the police or Christian organizations, like, it's not helping our people. and this has been well documented in so many reports, and I list all the reports at the end as well, because you know propaganda works. And
Absolutely.
a popular Canadian narrative is, oh my God, I'm so fragile, I don't know what to do with all this pain and suffering, but I want to help all the Indigenous people. We've given you the freaking reports how many times? How
And how
many
many
more do you
years?
need?
And how many
Decades.
years
Yeah.
of saying, okay, so, and so this is where we really bucking up against, and this is kind of what I see about trauma and the indoctrination that has happened to the globe, really, all people. We have had so I want to just say this patriarchal ideology that has been ruling our planet for eons is not about men. It is a very toxic masculine energy from my point of view. And it doesn't just hurt women. It doesn't just oppress women. If you oppress the women of a society, you are oppressing everyone. You're oppressing the men. You are if you are taking away a woman's right to determine her own body, to make decisions on reproduction and so forth, you are also handcuffing the male that involved with that woman. If it's, if they're heterosexual couple, you are putting them into poverty. And poverty, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, which is like a triangle, a pyramid, on the bottom of when he was looking at our evolution and how we come to these places of being able to self-actualize, to realize our power, you look at the top of the pyramid, but the bottom part is where we're in survival. And how do you keep people in survival mode? Well, believing, one, that you're going to die and you're going to die from, and they'll give you all the reasons, things you're going to die from. So you should be afraid. And also the concept of being able to think outside of the box, and how wrong that is. The indoctrination from this it's kind of a tribal thing, but we have all these different tribes. And like, I don't speak for all women. I don't speak for all settlers. I don't speak for all of the people of my heritage, Irish, English, Scottish, Polish. My mother's father was a Polish immigrant, was smuggled out of Poland during the war in the early 1900s, before the war. So he became a Canadian immigrant, never was so grateful except for being welcomed into this country. But he, and all of that history was about oppression. And so you keep those people. He couldn't speak freely. He was always terrified of being sent back. He had to be, he had to fit the little box, and we all have these little boxes. And that is the bottom part of that pyramid.
Which, by the way, he actually appropriated from a Blackfoot. So Maslow's hierarchy is actually appropriated from the Blackfoot. So if anyone were to Google Maslow's hierarchy pyramid and
Yes.
type Blackfoot on top of that, you'll see that was actually something he stole from.
Oh, I'm so not surprised. Yeah. I'm so not surprised. I mean, there is so much of the wisdom that we have being shared by many people that was as not being attributed to the right peoples or people. And so that does not surprise me. But just the same, it's the understanding that if you can keep people in fear, you can control them. You can make them do all kinds of things, right? Yeah. And so what I was noticing was that the trauma, when you're in trauma, and trauma is not dealt with, and we don't have the skills to deal with trauma appropriately. Yeah. Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate talks about not just about addiction, but he really makes such a powerful point. It's not why addiction, it's why the pain, right? And so what do we do with that pain? And we're hearing so many people, like when I heard the stories about the Indigenous graves near schools and what have you, and like you say, the news and white people reacting to it as if it was their wound. And how could this happen? Well, how many times have you been in a situation where you didn't speak up? How many
Mhm.
times? And I know for myself, I didn't have a healthy understanding of Indigenous history in Canada. I had what you know the victors wrote the books, right? And it's the same, with women's lives. It is never told the way that it really was. But when I was raised Roman Catholic, so for a long time, that is also part of this indoctrination, whether or not people are practicing Catholics anymore or not, and or Anglican or any of the ones that were in charge of these residential schools. When you look at history, we've only had small numbers at the top that were invading country after country after country. And North America's relatively new invasion by the colonial systems, but it's been happening. Ireland, when I look at Ireland, how many times it was invaded by different peoples, and then the people that invaded oppressed the ones that were there. But the thing of it is, it's the people at the top that made the rules, and the rest of us, like little ants, carrying out the orders. I mean, it's always been the little people, so to speak, but really the masses of people who go to war, who we're the one who bring children into the world who end up being massacred on some old man's dream about fighting for something. And we're not the ones who ever benefited from those wars. And it's always been for the profit of the few and at the expense of the masses, right?
Mhm.
So, but how do you get people to go to war and kill other people? You've got to keep them in fear. You've got to create an enemy that they can visualize. It's because of that person that you don't have what you want. And I think that in Canada, we have had that. I mean, when I grew up, all I heard about was the drunken Indian. And I don't think there's a Canadian my age or even younger that hadn't heard that, because I remember going on a field trip as a young girl to Moosonee, I think it was, in Northern Ontario. And we had to take up boats, and they took us, to go and visit kids on this reserve. I don't recall learning much about the culture at all. It was, I hate to say it, but it felt like going to the zoo. It felt like looking at people who were not like us. And it was really sad when I look back on it, because we could have learned so much from an experience like that, but we just didn't have those experiences. So that's one thing, is the fear.
Can I just kind
Yes.
of give some context to that? I think that a lot of Canadians or Indigenous people need to understand that today we're having folks deny the genocide of these Indian residential prisons, and I think the purpose of doing those field trips at that time was to try to legitimize the genocide, and having folks like you in denial, being like, well, I remember traveling there and I didn't see anything bad. And I think a lot of folks are unaware that was the purpose of doing that, was to try to legitimize the genocide that they were doing, and to try
Yeah.
to pretend like things were okay. And yet here you were not feeling comfortable at all, and even compared it to being a zoo.
I absolutely, even as a young child. I mean, I was always very intuitive, very, I observed things that other people didn't. I had a very active dream time, and a very, I was really connected to spirit, even though I was really shut down for that. That was not acceptable. I wasn't supposed to know things because I was a kid. I was supposed to be just shut up and right until I was older. That was always a thing. When you're older, you can have something to say about anything. And the other incident that I had was with a teacher, and it was in school. It was about grade 6. And we didn't have a lot of kids that were mixed race or Indigenous or in the classrooms. Like I don't remember. We had, French, English, it was a Catholic school. But we had one boy, I remember, tall, handsome young guy, so about grade 6. And for some reason, he wasn't fitting in that little box that that teacher wanted. And she actually got into a physical fight with him. And the thing was about it was that, I mean, I was traumatized by watching it. I was traumatized by watching. I didn't understand why she was doing it. I didn't understand what he had done to deserve it. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. And it was actually a physical, like desk was being moved and things like this. And this is, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s. And again, I didn't know. I mean, he wasn't even in the classroom that long enough for me to have connected with him, to know who he was, where he, you know, I knew he lived outside of town. I didn't know exactly that much about him or his family or anything like that. But the thing was, I had also had an experience about in grade 4 with another boy, and he was not Indigenous. And this teacher happened to be another, I'm the saddest, strange teachers sometimes. Mm-hmm. And she had humiliated this kid for absolutely no reason. She made him stand up on the chair, and she had a big, long ruler, and she was going to beat him with it. But she was going to beat him. She told him he had to pull his pants down so she could do it. Standing up on a chair. And the boy was not, he was, I would say now looking back, he was a very sensitive kind of a kid. And he really did, you could tell he didn't understand. And that was the first time I really felt like shame and how people can be so manipulated through those tactics, shame and humiliation, and you're not good enough and you're not the right whatever. I don't know what her issue was with him, because I wasn't old enough. It was like grade 3 or 4. So when it happened to the Indigenous young guy in grade 6, I didn't connect it that it was because of that. I had, by that time, I was already pretty well aware that the teachers weren't necessarily always teaching life. They had their own agendas. I mean, I was a bit of a rebel. I definitely stood up to teachers a lot and got myself into trouble. Visited the principal's office a lot, but I could see things. I could see the big picture and I could see the small picture, but I couldn't see what was being hidden from me. Mm-hmm. I couldn't see all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But I also had, you know, this is where some of our trauma and repeated trauma and generational trauma that keeps us shut up, that keeps us from stepping out, because it's not just what happened to us. This is a big thing for me. And this is something I'm really going to expand more in my book. And that is, what did it mean? We give meaning to our lives and we interpret what happens to us and give it a meaning. Like, that happened to me because I'm a bad person. That happened to me because it didn't happen to anyone else. So why did it happen to me? You know, and without having resources to discuss trauma, to discuss what happened, and even to go further than that, to understand that there's only one way off this planet. Only one way. We are going to die. We cannot prevent that. And we don't know when. It's not, it's as if we act and live as if there's an option that like, if you do this, you're going to die, or you do that, you're going to die. It's the constant threat. And part of that, you're going to die, is how. And if you're rejected by your community, by your tribe, by your gender, by your family, for having a different, your instinct, your survival instinct kicks in, you're going to die. Because I think that is part of our history as human beings. If you get rejected from your family, or, and way back before cities and living in the wild, you were shunned by the community, you would die. You have nothing on your own. So that's in us, that sense of being disowned. But I had this revelation just recently, actually, about being disowned and how that's been used on us as a tool. If you if you speak up, if you do anything that's not in the box, we'll disown you. And being disowned is just absolutely the worst thing. And I was doing the dishes one night, and all of a sudden it hit me like a brick. I was like, what is so wrong with being disowned? How incredible. I mean, do I want to be owned in reality? And I realized that came from my generational the slavery. When a slave was disowned in the African slaves, we hear this through the history. Now, I'm not sure, I'm quoting whatever was written, but when the laws changed in the United States and people were let go and declared free, they hadn't been prepared for that freedom. So they were used to the master controlling them, the master putting the food on the table or providing for them. So given your freedom and being disowned in that situation, a lot of them perished because of the system that had been set up. If you were owned by this person, you had certain rights, and if you weren't, you didn't.
Well,
Same
I
as
was
women.
just watched a show about putting the K in Ku Klux Klan last night, a documentary, and it actually did discuss that moment in time where after the Confederate side lost, how they actually were afraid and created the KKK as a tool. And it was actually a Scottish documentarian who talked about it and really discussed how white fear was murdering Black people and getting away with it because, as you know, because you've been a part of government, government doesn't act swiftly. And they were perfectly okay with the murder of many Black people in order to appease the voters. And they actually had made a point that a lot of folks who fought for the Confederate side lost their right to vote. And that was really where this came from, this, control of Black people. So it's a really interesting conversation to have about loss of control for sure, and
Yeah.
fear and how they are put together. So I hope people really put that together. And the whole point of the documentary was really the Scottish filmmaker just being in shock that his own people who were oppressed in Scotland came to America to create this better life and got used to being people of privilege, and then were afraid when they were losing their privilege. And I think that's completely relevant to right now in 2021, where you're seeing a vast majority of very privileged Canadians that are very used to the genocide of Indigenous people and keeping people in their place, as you so adequately described in school, how teachers are one of the first tools of beating us. And by the way, one of the TRC calls to action was to actually take criminal, or to take out physical punishment out of the criminal code, and it still hasn't gotten done. And to me, that should be the signal to Canada. Folks like myself, we just took my daughter, she just left the school system, and because of homophobia and racism. But when that's the whole point, is that the system is not designed. It's babysitting at best. It's trauma at its worst. And with the Indigenous population, of course, they did it in as a large scale policy, which contributed to the genocide. And then here we and loss of language, loss of identity. So it's interesting you talking about being disowned, because this concept of cultural genocide, in the sense that we've lost our language and our community and our ways of life, this is a loss we deal with. And this is the impetus of a lot of suicide that we have as well, the lack of change and the lack of identity. And then of course the nurses and doctors being the first tool of colonialism and stealing the children away from their parents and putting them in foster systems. Loss of family, like it's a big conversation that we're having in our community because of the government policies that have been imposed on our people.
Well,
So
and most Canadians do not know. They don't. I first learned about the Indian Act from Wab Kinu's CBC documentary he did. It was called Eighth Fire. And I didn't know how how often we heard, well, the lazy Indian, or they just don't want to work, or they just, we gave them all this land, like that. So much ignorance. But to understand that with the Indian Act, it actually prevented people from, from basic livelihoods, from owning a tractor, from meeting together, from gathering. How do you plant a communal garden to feed your people if you can't meet with the other people that are going to work with them? Just simple things like that we just didn't talk about it, and we didn't know. And I agree with you that part of the indoctrination, one of the biggest tools, is to traumatize, because we I don't know I don't know that every one of the people that did it knew consciously what they were doing. We had corporal punishment in school for everybody. But when a child was traumatized, and you as another child, powerless in a society of adult rules, and you watch that, you are getting a lesson that if you step out of line, especially when I didn't know what he did, I didn't know what had caused it. So I was always suspicious and questioning. And that's what I mean about meaning. What did that mean? What was the thing with the teacher who, and to understand, I do think this patriarchal dominance, oppression has been orchestrated. I do think it was a conscious knowing that if we can oppress and keep that feminine down, and I don't mean just females, the feminine energy, just to keep it down, that they could continue to rule the world. And I don't know what their agenda is, but I definitely know there is one. That is in my gut, is there is an agenda. And we are so often threatened, shamed, criticized for questioning, not just for speaking out against something, but saying, hey, does that make sense to you? Like, we can't even say that to each other. It's not, you see, social media is full of these one-liners of hate and fear, and telling other people to shut up when they're seeing a headline and saying, is that true? Like, is there another source? Don't question me on my sources. I've posted this because it's from this news center, that kind of thing. And it's like, no, but that's not the question. It's like, what's the story behind the story? What's the, why do they use those particular headlines? What are they trying to do? And this is one that, is very personal for me. So in 2012, my son was killed in a one vehicle rollover accident on his way back from Saskatchewan to Calgary. And there were 5 young people in the vehicle, and it was a really bad accident. It was everyone was ejected from the vehicle, everyone. The vehicle basically ripped apart. And the headlines read, the RCMP came and notified me in the early morning. They couldn't identify my son yet. They 3 of them died instantly, and 2 of them miraculously survived, which is really where it's like, it's not that random. 5 of them should have been dead in theory, 2 of them weren't. So that really confirmed for me was my son's time to go, because there's only one way off the planet. And that's why I keep saying that, is because, people have said to me, how can you be okay with that? It's like, how can I don't own my son. I don't know what his life plan is. I don't know why he came and why he left when he left. I don't know any of that. That's not my business. My business is to enjoy the gift that came through me, not to own it, not to try to control it, not to force him to be this or that or do it, whatever. People try to make that my, well, he didn't get married, he didn't have kids, you don't have grandchildren, you're missing out, you're blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm not missing. How can I miss? That's ridiculous. It wasn't my life to live. This is my life to live. His life was to do what he did and get out of here. And that's what he did. And so I'm not angry about that. I was angry at the time, of course. It was like, oh my God, how can this be happening? But what made me angry and was a good impetus for me to get rid of some anger was that the headline said, so, and I can't quote exactly, I have the clipping here somewhere, but basically what it said is five, it didn't say 5 dead, but it said 5 people were, this horrific accident, and they may not have been wearing seatbelts. Now, they might as well said may not have been wearing socks, because when you say it like that, it implies the socks would have played a role in them not dying or dying, and that the seatbelts, if they would have been wearing them, would have prevented their deaths. And the truth was they were wearing seatbelts, and the RCMP knew this because of the crash site. They knew. The autopsy confirmed my son was wearing a seatbelt because of the injuries. But the seats were ejected from the vehicle. So the seatbelt was not a factor, but they put that in the headlines. And so I was angry, really angry at the media. I thought, this is not a truth. This is a flat out lie. And you're using my son's death to promote a lie. Mm-hmm. And I wear my seatbelt, and I knew my son always wore his seatbelt. And it's not that I thought it was going to keep me from dying. I just wear it because I'm used to it more than anything, Yeah. But so anyway, I found out who the media person was, and I reamed them out about it. And he just said, we got the report from the RCMP. That's what they released to us. That's what we printed. That's what it was. So this media person didn't even have enough curiosity to go beyond what he had been given. He didn't go and look for himself. He didn't investigate further. He just, it was, to me, it's very lazy journalism, because if you're going to put that on a headline, you better know there's some facts behind that. And then, of course, he thought by saying that he got it from the RCMP, he was off the hook, and I should accept that authority. Now, here's the thing. My father was an RCMP officer, head of a detachment in Manitoba. So I grew up living in a detachment. My father died prematurely of a heart attack when I was 9 years old. He was only 37. So that was my first major trauma, life-altering event. And I had a lot of illusions about the RCMP because my dad was a really great guy, and I knew that he was fair with people. I had seen him in action being fair with people. So I had, as a child, transferred that to all RCMP. I had started to have, by the time my son's accident, I had started to have some realization that just because you're part of a group doesn't mean you're all the same. All women are not the same as me. All RCMP officers are not the same. They're all individuals. So anyway, but so that instead of it being me accepting that as authority, this was me saying, the RCMP lied to you, lied to me, lied. So this was another trauma, right? Because I was feeling it like personal. Yeah. So I phoned the RCMP detachment, and I spoke to the sergeant. It was a woman. And I explained to her that that headline was a lie. And she said, yes, but she said, whenever an accident, something major like this happens that makes national headlines, we use it to educate the public. And that's, I said, you didn't educate anybody. You lied. You told people that if they wore their seatbelt, they wouldn't die. And that's a lie, because there is no guarantee when you're going to die and when you're not, whether you have the seatbelt on or you're not. And she just totally dismissed me. Yeah. She didn't give it one. It was like, and so that's when I started to say, there is an agenda to indoctrinate people, to build on our fear, to get us to do things that we would or wouldn't do, on our own, and call it education. It's not education, it's
You know,
indoctrination.
I think everything you just said is so critical and important for people who are not in Alberta to understand the way we think as Albertans, because not yesterday, but the day before, I'm certain you must have heard about the 14-year-old that died in the health system. And the parents, the family really spoke out and said he did not die of COVID-19 as you suggested, but he actually had died of stage 4 cancer. And as of yesterday, I seen both Rachel Notley and Dina Hinshaw apologize for implying that he died of COVID-19. And, and I think it's relevant to what you're saying, because it's an example of, at the time, it made sense for everybody to use his death as an example of why it is you should get vaccinated in the middle of a global pandemic. But actually, because it is propaganda and it was inappropriate to use this death in that capacity, when people found out, they apologized. And I was shocked, actually, that Dr. Dina Hinshaw apologized, because that's actually not the norm. That it would be the opposite, to ignore it and move on, just as we see other, politicians and other
But it
folks
does,
do that.
each time
Yep.
a person has an experience, a personal experience, that's when, and this has been happening to a lot of people I've spoken to, and when I was in politics, I mean, I did not get elected. I ran into elections, but I wasn't elected into to office in that way. I was president of a federal political party, but I was not elected as a member of parliament or legislature. However, I participated in candidate debates, and I was very aware that what happened in a debate in public with all kinds of people there, all the candidates, and then was reported in the news the next day, was not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was not what happened in the event. And that happened more than once. And so it was very clear to me that this is being, and also even the public, that's the other part of it. It's not just, I'm not trying to bash the media, and there are very good journalists, and that's fine. But the reality is, people need to be free to question everything. Yeah. Question everything. I used to make a joke about myself. I'm stuck in the 3-year-old why? Because if we don't question it, if we accept everything the way it is, this is why we're yelling at each other. This is why we're being violent towards other people who are saying, like the Indigenous people who are saying, hey, listen, this happened to us. And I feel like a lot of people are non-Indigenous people have also been traumatized in a different way. And this is triggering for them in a way. It's almost like because they weren't hurt either. They weren't hurt in their trauma. Maybe they became addicts, they did whatever. And they're seeing all this attention being given to, something that's not an individual thing. It's a global thing, genocide. But it's personal for them because it's triggered their trauma again. And they're saying, I wasn't heard, I wasn't compensated, I wasn't, and they can't even look or think or question beyond that. If you were traumatized or sexually assaulted by your family member within your family situation, it is traumatic, it is horrific, it is, and I totally get that we did not have the tools to help people. There was nowhere you could go to speak. I get that. But in the case of the Indigenous people, it wasn't their family that was doing it. It was the government, the society, and they weren't just doing it to one person. When you look at what happened in the residential schools, child after child after child, and I am sure we have not heard the whole of it. And this may be politically incorrect, but I have to say this because I can. But I want to know why no one's talking about the Queen in all of this. We keep hearing about, and this may be just my own ignorance, but We talk about, the Canadian government has to do this, it should have done this, and needs to pay and whatever. But the Queen, our current Queen, has been the Queen since the late 1940s or early 50s. I wasn't alive when she was coronated, but I do recall that. So she's been on the throne an awfully long time. And a lot of this stuff came from that British crown colonialism. That's what this whole country was founded on. And the fight between them and Quebec and France, being able to, who was going to control this land mass, the resources, and get rid of the indigenous people that were in the way. And I wonder why that has, why I don't know the answer to it, but I know that nobody.
I know, I can tell you point blank that settlers do not have their algorithms set for Canadian or for Indigenous voices. Literally yesterday, I was calling out the Prince William for having the fucking audacity for being like, these world leaders and their climate change policies. And ultimately, white settler colonialism has even taken climate change voices away from Indigenous people. And if you wouldn't have perpetrated genocide globally on Indigenous people, genocide, like our people were taking care of the land for thousands of years. And the moment a bunch of settlers show up, is the world just completely has gone into this disarray. So like 100%, and I call it out, and I know many of the Indigenous community call it out. But the problem with settlers is they cannot give control to Indigenous voices. The algorithms are set so that you can't see it, and even then, a lot of anti-Indigenous bias is still in there, and they would rather make their own narrative than retweet an Indigenous person. And that is 100% seen. I've been on social media for years now, for because 2007 was when I had my daughter, and I've seen it, and I can show you the algorithms that show up. If I retweet a settler, it will get retweeted. But if I put out my own words, like maybe 6 people will see it. It's incredible.
I find that I have to, because that is my belief, is that it's not my voice that needs to be heard. And I've said this over and over again to people. Yeah. It's me retweeting, giving my platform to other people who are Indigenous, who know what's going on, and to share what they're saying. That's what I try to do, but I have to look for it. I have to look for your tweets. I've been following you for a long time, but I have not seen your tweets showing up on a regular in my feed. I see the same people over and over again. And, it's, to me, noteworthy that Blackfoot Sharna is her handle on Twitter. She is an outspoken Indigenous woman, and her account was suspended throughout the whole of the election. And she said it was after the polls closed in BC, about 2 minutes after it, she could tweet again. Now that is, beyond I do understand it, because I know that there are people who are controlling Twitter and Facebook who have a different agenda. I know that. And I think this is what annoys me most of all, is that every time people say, connect the dots, follow the money, look into this, question it, you're a conspiracy theorist. And I'm so sick of hearing that, because there are conspiracies going on. It's not a theory. There are conspiracies. There have been conspiracies. We know that. It's not rocket science, for crying out loud. It was a conspiracy. Call it genocide was planned. It was I don't call it a conspiracy. It was written down. They had a playbook, for Christ's sakes. How much more clear could it be? And the fact that it's continuing, and voices are still being silenced. And when you try to question, I never know, like, I'm not going to retweet somebody just because they're Indigenous, because there are people who will, like, because I don't know that I'm just going by their Twitter profile, right? But I tweet what has content. I'm not just going to tweet out somebody's message if it's just hate filled. But if it has content, if it is actually questioning what's going on, or even if it's just angry, but it has if there's a reason to listen to this, then I will do that. But I'm not just, I'm questioning everything. I question everything everybody says because I want the truth. And I know that we're not getting it.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. I used to be in the 9/11 truther movement actually at one point in time because they were the only ones willing to talk about the genocide that happened. I had visited my grandmother's residential school, and I mean, they had a huge memorial with all of the dead people long before TRC was ever there. And I like the field is clear, like you don't walk around it, you stay in between these little white rocks because you actually don't know where all the graves are. And even those rocks, you very well could be walking on the graves of people as far as you know. It's they were the only people giving us space, and the Canadian media, the Canadian public, they've been trained to silence our elders, Indigenous voices forever. And that said, like Canagis Manuel, she has been fighting on the land against the pipeline, and like she's just outright fuck you RCMP. And I see settlers that are just too fragile to even retweet that. And so I know by being a bystander and being complicit, this is not somebody who is my ally. They will stand by and be complicit when I get killed by the RCMP, my daughter gets apprehended, whatever, trauma is happening to me.
Yeah.
Because that's what Canadians do. And that's what they've always done. And worse, they even vote for it. So like here in Alberta, Jason Kenney has long history of like the barbaric snitch line and all of these awful racist practices that federally, and yet Albertans proudly voted for him. So,
I know.
But
that's where I say about indoctrination. It is powerful. And I, from a spiritual point of view, metaphysical point of view, I know this planet is shifting. She has shifted. She is moving into a higher frequency, and she is not going to tolerate this kill or be killed attitude that we've had against each other. She's going to survive. She's going to go on, whether or not we're capable of living on her or not. But it's this whole idea that we have been taught to accept everything that is stated in media without question, is stated by politicians. It's promises that cannot be kept or that won't be kept. I mean, I remember when Andrew Scheer ran in his riding several times, and it was quoted everywhere that he actually said, "I don't need your Indian votes."
Yep.
And then I looked up because there was a young Indigenous guy who was running in that riding the previous times. Sinclair, I believe is his last name.
Yeah, so Rita Sinclair is a part of my party. I know you haven't name dropped it, but I'm a liberal, and I know since you name dropped Sharna Blackfoot, she's a liberal. I'm part of the Indigenous Peoples Commission. This is a great example of the racism where, ultimately she doesn't identify as Indigenous enough to be a part of the Indigenous Peoples Commission, but liberals and so-called supporters will not retweet Indigenous Peoples Commission voices at all. It doesn't will not do it. It's like the greatest example of racism in our progressive circles. And worse, not even vote for our policies when we put them forward. So, this is that example of how even when we're supposed to be in those same like-minded red tent, we're not. But anyway, our Sinclair grandsons of Rena both ran in the last election, and actually one of them even came and helped George Chahal get elected. So because he needed all hands on deck, all phone calls, all of those things. And a lot of people have, like, you've ran, so you know what it's like, but a lot of people haven't. And they think that this is an easy thing to do, and it's not. Like,
no, it's
not. You have all these youth in George Chahal's office making these phone calls. You have all these youth out in the public, putting up these signs and door knocking with him, and it's not fun. It sucks, and a lot of campaigns are so toxic. One of my favorite ones I've been a part of is Marilyn North Pagans, and she has basically like folks from the entertainment industry and security that are helping her. So they don't have the same toxic mentality that a lot of the kids from straight from poli-sci bring into these parties and put out there. So it's been really good. But I know Rena, the Indigenous Peoples Commission, her grandsons who both ran for the Liberal Party, we were all putting it out there. But do you think you can get a Liberal to retweet us? No way. No way. There's way too much settler control there. So, you know,
I was tweeting out this young guy. It was the last election, and because I was just horrified. For one thing, he was a young guy, lots of passion. He was intelligent. He was industrious. He was all the things Andrew Scheer was not. And on top of that, he was Indigenous, and there was, I forget how many reserves they have in that riding that Andrew Scheer had never visited, according to the chiefs. It was reported. I had to look for it, but because I wanted to know what are the Indigenous people saying about are they feeling well supported? And of course they were not. But here's the thing that just blew my mind. After everything he did federally, Andrew Scheer, or didn't do, however you want to call it, he ran again, even though he was told, get lost as far as the party leadership. He ran again in that riding and got elected. Now, there is something very wrong with our society that we cannot see through this pure and utter bullshit. And I mean, I'm only one person, and I'm not trying to, I certainly don't. I'm actually not a party person anymore, having been through the process with parties. But what I do is I select the party with the best vision, with the biggest, even though they're not perfect. I don't expect them to be. I know when I ran, I wasn't perfect. I wasn't offering myself as perfect. Humans with real passion. That's what I'm looking for. Real leadership, not the person who gets in front of the parade that's already going. I mean, the person who is going and you want to follow. That's leadership. That's Gandhi energy. That's that kind of, but I don't feel as helpless as I'm hearing some people say, because I think that is, I guess because I've been through so much trauma in my own life that it's, when I feel helpless, I do something.
Yeah, I'm not that person either. I don't know what it's like to be helpless, because there's always something that can be done. There's no question to me. And whether or not people listen, that's up to them. But, it's not from a lack of helplessness, that's for sure. And I think that is what, the issue with suicide is, that the helplessness comes from that, where it's like, you've tried, you've come to nowhere. But then a movie like Night Raiders or Dune comes out, where I think people are forced to remember, societies reset themselves. And, our people have been here for thousands of years. Now we're going to have a whole bunch of newcomers in our blood, thanks to rape, colonialism, and everything else. And now we're at a point where clean drinking water is a global problem. It's always been a problem since Canadian industrial capitalism has ruined the water systems across the country.
There's a good predatory capitalism, what it's called, predatory capitalism. There's a book by John Perkins, I think it is, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he explains very clearly. If people haven't read that book or seen his videos, check it out. Like, if you think we're not being used, manipulated, traumatized for a greater purpose, that's not for us. I mean, pitting us against each other, settler against Indigenous people, instead of recognizing we're all one. And this whole concept of,
well, I can tell you Indigenous don't feel that way, but settlers do, because they've been indoctrinated that way. And
you don't feel we're all one?
No, I feel like settlers think there's an us versus them mentality, but it's actually the settlers that do that, not Indigenous. Because been welcoming. We've
No, I know,
signed the
I know. Are
treaties,
you kidding?
Yeah.
Even in the so-called Christian religions, is us and them. It's the Protestants or the Catholics, or it's you're not Christian enough, and that kind of crap. And it's just it's humans, man, usually making God in its image, not awareness of what is God. And I'm not here to say, but I just can see this. There's so much. Like I feel cheated. I feel cheated by not knowing the history and the wisdom of the Indigenous people. I feel like it's not just, it's a crime against humanity. It's a crime against the Indigenous people for thriving, for generations of gifts that we will never see because they're buried underground, because the Einsteins of the future were in those little schools with be under so much horror, and even the ones that survived have so many wounds that it's so hard to bring the gifts forward. And I know that because I only just started to bring forward my art, which is something I didn't even know I could do, because all I knew how to do was duty, obligation, duty to the family, duty to the church, duty to society, as a woman, as a mother, as a whatever, doing my job. And not to say that it's not about, it's not, it's getting to that point where we understand what is the meaning of life. Why are we here? We can't take any of it with us. We are not going to get brownie points on the other side because we squashed a whole bunch of other people to get to the top of our imaginary pyramid. We are not, none of that stuff matters. And I just feel like I was really pissed about the Truth and Reconciliation Day, and the fact that I expected, Remembrance Day.
I'm going to stop you there because I know that's why you were blocked. And I'm going to point this out right now, is that it really upset me that settlers thought they had a voice in this at all, frankly, and that they fell for conservative media, and that they, put out their opinions at all instead of, and took away from all the survivors. And that's what happened. And I'm so angry about it that I just went on mass blockings. I can't stand it. I cannot stand how settlers constantly take away our voices. And it really upset me that day more than any day, that settlers thought it was their point at any point to put in their opinion other than to share Indian residential school survivors' voices. It really upset me. And it really upset me the way the liberals would, so this Sharma lady that you talk about, they parade her around because she's the token Indian that says what she wants, that says exactly what they want her to say. And that's problematic because she has hurt a lot of the Indigenous community.
I'm so sorry.
Yes.
I did not know that.
I know. So I know, because nobody listens. And that's the problem. So as she explores her red world, I know that our Indigenous community will bring her in if she was willing to listen. But we have tried to engage with her for years. She's not engaging back. So she's really quite harmful, actually, to our community. And the fact is, we need the only voice that matters on September 30th are Indigenous survivors' stories. That's it.
But that's what I'm saying. I thought that our media, naive, but I thought we were moving forward. I thought that whole day and the night before and whatever would have been listening to you, listening to people like you, chiefs, and not just that, survivors, and explaining to us. Tell us what this friggin' Indian Act is about. Why is it still around? What is going on with it? Help us to understand how people were oppressed, how it is that, because the trauma isn't just from the residential schools, although that is bad enough. It's the other stuff that prevented Indigenous people from thriving, from, and not about them integrating. not about them integrating, but thriving. Like there should be whole universities and shit. I'm sorry. I feel so, I will say that the one thing that is most upsetting to me is that there's no playbook on this, on how the fuck to get it right. That's the problem, is
But
trying
there
to
is,
help.
and that's the problem. And it's been
Okay.
established. So 1996, there was over 400 recommendations on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And settlers went, eh. And then in 2015, we gave, volumes of books. And they went, and then they had the audacity to put in their opinion of shock and horror when they found the bodies that were literally in the smallest, tiniest summaries of the TRC that had been existing since 2015. And that is excluding the voices of the Indigenous people that have been telling people, like the very memorials that were there at my family's Indian residential school. Like to feel gaslit is an understatement. And I didn't even go through the stupid school system. They did. And as obviously somebody who is a part of their family, it's my job to remind Canadians this has to be fixed now. And so it's just so frustrating. I can't even tell you how upsetting it is. Like, I've had a book club since 2015. It's been free, open to the public, started by, it was an initiative Carolyn Bennett put out to everybody, every Canadian in 2015 to start a book club. And honestly, it's a small minority on September 30th, rather than, mourning or reflecting or focusing on my healing. I was busy putting in candidates' crappy racist opinions on Indigenous people because we have a stupid election coming up. And I knew on October 4th, when we had the Sisters in Spirit Vigil, there was no way I was going to be able to get all of that inputted by then. So I had to do it on September 30th rather than, just be me and mourn and think about all of the things I have to reclaim. But to me, that is really important work, because to this day, people still don't get reconciliation, and it's 2021 after all of these reports. So anyway, I can tell you and I could probably talk forever, and I'm grateful for that. So when your book is released, I definitely encourage you to come back to my show, and we will talk about it, have part 2, and go from there. And is there anything else that you'd like to close with?
I just want to thank you for sharing with me and for helping me to understand things that I didn't understand before. And I think the conversation just has to go on. We just have to have them. We have to, and beyond the conversation, the action that goes beyond the conversation. Because and I think that'll happen naturally if we have the conversations. But if people are interested in my work, my art, my book, they can absolutely check out my website. And I'm on all my links to social media are on there, claritywhisperartandsoul.com.
Right on. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you so much.
All right. And I'm going to say my closing with some resources. So if you end up having a resource that you want to promote, please don't hesitate to kind of interject, and we'll go from there.
Awesome.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm really proud that this podcast has given solutions, cultural safety training, cultural first aid in all of them to create a safer place for Indigenous, people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. Thank you, authors Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of What is Indigenous Cultural Safety and Why I Should Care About It. Their work in those cultural action tools I've said over 100 times in my podcast, so please support Indigenous work like that as a part of your reconciliation work in settler understanding. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism and lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized folks experience by the structure of racism imposed on these lands with the Indian Act, Indian Residential School, and other land clearing policies. RacialEquityTools.org, What is Internalized Racism by Donna Bevins. I really encourage people who don't understand oppression dynamics to learn about oppression dynamics, read that and see how we are contributing. And arguably, I just contributed with talking about one of these online profile people who are disconnected from their Indigenous community. We have tried to engage, but they don't want to engage back. So these are things that of lateral violence, internalized racism, that we all need to address. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee has some great information about how to engage if you're seeing a woman with a hijab or somebody being targeted in a negative way. Also, there's acttoendracism.ca, where you can also text at 587-507-3838. They're actually a coalition of the Asian communities trying to address the hate that especially, I mean, it's been longstanding and historical, and of course popped up even worse during this pandemic. Indigenous have been talking about these issues, sharing our traumas and reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties, listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they are cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, or just have a lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports on child welfare reform, violence prevention, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational, justice, and health institutions, with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. They don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism. They literally have zero business running. Should be understood by all parties, politicians, community organizations, sports clubs, etc. A great article that is out there is Truth Before Truth, how non-Indigenous Canadians become allies. And actually now there are so many articles out there on how non-Indigenous Canadians can be allies if you just Google it. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today and want to talk, call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. It is toll free, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you go to their website, hopeforwellness.ca, they do have a text box. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, there's a toll-free number at 844-413-6649. It is 24/7 as well. And for non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area, usually a functioning 211. And if not, you can call 833-456-4566. If you are a 60 Scoop survivor, there is the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta at ssisa.ca, and you can look for hashtag survivor driven. If you experience racism, please report it at stophate.ca, as well as Act to End Racism. I want to give a shout out to the Trevor Project. They have tons of LGBTQ2 plus crisis supports, and strongly recommend them both in Canada and in the US. And then here in Canada, the Kids Help Phone at 1-800-668-6868. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. That's why I started the podcast, to speak freely without interruption, tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting, as many people don't want to hear our opinion, but sure want to tell us theirs, usually by people who know nothing about Indigenous people, colonialism, the constant surveillance of our people, protest and vigils, and our rights. Microaggressions, people dealing with internalized racism, gatekeepers that survive off the status quo, or people who are really in their trauma and are unable to do the work. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. That's why I started this podcast. And as a place for our voices to be heard without there being, funding cut by provincial or federal people. So thank you to my ancestors, my granny, my mom, of what strength looks like through your example, my numerous aunts and uncles that will keep me in my place if I need to be, my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots. She is a first generation Calgarian, so I am a second generation Calgarian, but I make fun of anybody who calls themselves a native whatever if they're non-Indigenous, because that's racist. Thank you to my husband, Darcy, for producing and editing the show. On top of being my husband, my childhood friend, the father of our child, he has been my support of my journey down this red road, and he has witnessed decades of racism and sexism. To our child, We are blessed to learn from daily. We are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. And I hope one day that my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to the previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. Really, I can't stress that enough, folks who have donated, especially recently. And that said, if you are a person that doesn't understand land acknowledgement or wants to pick my brain, you can go to my website at nativecalgarian.com to, get those services. So I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com. I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe, and we have pin posts on social media. And I want to end by giving side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not your dish. And my beautiful cousin would respond, or you'd be in my dish. Thank you for listening.